Hello and welcome to this session. We're going to be talking about sentence diagramming today, and I trust that what we do will be helpful for you to work out the exercises that we're going to be doing and make sure it all makes sense. So there will be several practices that you'll be doing throughout the class here. At times you'll need to pause the video and then you can come back to it and keep going after you've done the practice. So let's talk about sentence diagramming, and today we're going to be talking about the Reed-Kellogg system. Now, some of you have already dealt with Kellogg and Reed. This is Alonzo Reed, and these are two names that are very important names as we talk about traditional linguistics. And yes, as we mentioned in class, this is in fact the Kellogg of the cereal family, and these were people who were very much involved in education. And they developed this system of diagramming as a means of teaching English, as a means of teaching English syntax. Now, we'll try to discuss or try to think about how practical this is as far as a way of teaching. But anyway, it's a classic way of looking at sentences, and I thought it'd be helpful for you to at least have an introduction to it. So let's get started. As we talk about this first issue, I think the first question that comes to mind is, why would anyone want to diagram a sentence? Now, I've asked you to read a PDF, and if you haven't done that, I would ask for you to go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and do that. Read that PDF about Sister Bernadetta and her, or Bernadetta, I can't remember her name now, and her barking dog. But you'll get an interesting view on sentence diagramming in that video and see what the author has to say about it. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and pause the video for just a minute, and then you can go do that, and then you can come back and join us here. But anyway, sentence diagramming is a graphical representation of syntax. In other words, syntax, English has its syntax, a specific way that puts sentences together, and this becomes a way of graphically presenting how English sentences go together. And in fact, what it actually ends up doing is it ends up noticing that English sentences can only be put together in a finite number of ways. There are only a certain number of structures that we're going to use as we're looking at English sentences. So I've mentioned here the basic common sentence patterns, and that's a major aspect of this kind of sentence diagramming. Actually, something that really no other sentence diagramming takes into account. Even though they're still actually diagramming the same sentences, this somehow has something special to it because it recognizes the types of sentences that English can put together, which in the end is, once again, as I said before, a finite number. In fact, it also works on identifying modification, which is focused on logical relationships much more than morphological relationships. What I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily represent word order. When you look at one of these sentence diagrams, it actually doesn't tell you the exact structure of word order. In fact, as native speakers, it's not hard for us to reconstitute these into what we would actually say. Although for a second language speaker, if English is not your first language, it might sometimes be hard to come in and decide exactly how these come together, because once again, that can change, or that may not be encoded in the information, although we as native speakers have a very clear idea about how the structure should be put together. And then the idea is that this becomes an analytical tool to study language. In other words, it's designed to make us think through the issues of syntax, think about what modifies what, think about what kind of structure we're dealing with, and then it allows us to see if we have actually understood the sentence in the same way as somebody else, for example. So having said all that, there are reasons for diagramming sentences, although I would say that this is definitely open to debate. And in fact, in modern educational settings, most people are moving away from this kind of sentence diagramming. I remember I remember doing this when I was in elementary school, in junior high, but even then I think many of the schools had moved away from it, and so you may not run into this very often, but I think it's an interesting topic for us to deal with and to talk about it, especially as we move on to talk about tree diagramming. This is going to give us at least something to compare tree diagrams with and decide what we think of it. This is going to come from Alonzo Reed and Brainerd Kellogg. Their Higher Lessons in English from 1877. I have a quotation here that I'd like to start off with. Reed and Kellogg say the following: "The objection to the diagram. The fact that the pictorial diagrams parts of a sentence according to their office and relations and not according to their," I should have moved that camera, I'm sorry, "and not in the order of speech has been spoken of as a fault. It is, on the contrary, a merit, for it teaches the pupil to look through the literary order and discover the logical order." All right, so you can see already that what they're doing here is they're arguing in favor of the fact that it doesn't maintain word order, that's what they're calling the literary order, but it makes a student consider and think about the logical order. When we talk about tree diagrams, we'll see that tree diagrams very much follow word order, the logical order, as Reed and Kellogg call it here. He thus learns what the literary order really is and sees that this may be varied indefinitely so long as the logical relations are kept clear. I have to say that that's not exactly true. It can be varied indefinitely. There are certain things that we do in syntax and certain things that we don't do in syntax, and I think that this makes it sound a bit more free than what it really is. The assertion that correct diagrams can be made mechanically is not borne out by the facts. This is yet another complaint about this, that it's a very mechanical thing. It doesn't make the students think, and what they're saying is it actually does make them think. It is easier to avoid precision in oral analysis than in written. The diagram drives the pupil to a most searching examination of the sentence, brings him face to face with every difficulty, and compels a decision on every point. Basically what they're saying here is the student, as he diagrams, he has to think about this. And so if we're analyzing sentences, if we're doing it orally, asking questions, we may skip over points, and yet diagramming requires the student to think through each issue and to really determine what's happening. Now, part of our problem here is we say, yeah, but when we're teaching English, and especially English as a second language or a foreign language, do we really have to do this? And once again, that's a very valid point and something that we'll be discussing as we move forward in this. But this is what Reed and Kellogg said back in the 19th century as they were dealing with these diagrams that certainly from the very beginning certain people questioned and were not quite sure that this was really the way to go. So the basic ideas. Well, number one, we're going to want to identify the main words of the sentence. Actually, later on, as we move into phrase structure grammar, think like transformational grammar, this would lead us in the direction of talking about head words. These are the words which actually govern other parts of the sentence, if we want to use that terminology as well. These would be words that end up being the subject of the sentence, or the main verb, or the direct object, or even the object of the preposition. Number two, divide between the subject and the predicate and the verb and its complement. So we'll talk about how this is done as we move forward here in just a minute, about how graphically we can represent these major divisions in the sentence. And then finally, adding modifiers where they fit logically. And as we've already seen, this system of diagramming does not take into account word order. It doesn't take into account the literary order as Reed and Kellogg expressed it, but rather the logical relationship. So let's jump into our first example. I started off with a very simple sentence: students study. I'd like to think that this sentence is real, it's correct. Maybe it doesn't always work out. Anyway, students study. You can't get any simpler than this. And so obviously what we have here, our first word, students, this is our subject of the sentence. Study is our verb. Now you notice that we have a baseline, so we start with this underline here. And then notice that there's a vertical line and it crosses through the baseline. That's very important in this sentence diagramming, because what that's telling us is that is the major division in the sentence. That is dividing between the subject, which in this case is simply the word students, and the predicate, which in this case is a very simple predicate. It's just the verb study. Obviously, as we start talking about some students study, some students never study, most students usually study. If we can modify the sentence that way, obviously we'd have to start adding new elements into the sentence, but the basic sentence pattern doesn't change. All right, so you notice at the bottom I've called these intransitive verbs. If you're familiar with that language, which I hope you are, you're locked into what we're talking about. Notice intransitive verbs never take a direct object. Now later on we can discuss different types of intransitive verbs. They have the ergative verb, and we can deal with some different things like that. But at this point, let's just simply call these intransitive verbs, in that they have no direct object. They have nothing that follows the verb itself other than adverbial modifiers, which answer questions like when, where, how, why, etc., etc. So we start off with the most simple type of diagram, and that's illustrated by this sentence. Let's go to our next example and complicate life just slightly. All right, so as we take the sentence, all students should study English grammar. All right, of course we have to have some sort of sentence like that in this context, right? But now we've moved into a different kind of sentence pattern. Before we talked about studying, students study, and that simply is a complete thought in and of itself. We didn't talk about what students study, but just simply the fact that they do study. Now we're going to talk about what they do study, and we end up with all students should study what? English grammar. That's what we will call the direct object. And so in this context, how do we illustrate that? Well, we notice that students should study follows the exact pattern of what we had before. So we see our students on the line, we see should study. Notice that this kind of diagramming, generally what it does, it takes auxiliary verbs and it simply puts them together with the verb. They're not represented graphically in any way that's distinct from the simple verb study. Notice once again we have our vertical line, which divides the baseline, and that tells us where our subject is and where our predicate is. But notice what we've added to this diagram now is the vertical line, which goes down to the baseline but doesn't cross through it, doesn't intersect it. It simply makes contact with it. That's to illustrate the division between the verb, the full verb, and the direct object, in this case, grammar. All right, very important in this kind of diagramming that the line does not cross through the baseline, because what we're trying to say here is the division between the verb and the direct object is not as strong as the division between the subject and the verb. So notice my head words. Students should study grammar. And now notice the secondary modifiers. So we've got all students. Notice it comes down in a horizontal or a diagonal line off students. Technically, we have no way of, it's not actually labeled what kind of word this is, but because I know this diagramming system, I immediately recognize that to be some sort of determiner. Now later on, people have done more specification to try to distinguish between different types of determiners, and all is kind of an interesting determiner. But at this point, notice it's working like any basic determiner. Actually, probably at this point they would have called it an adjective, because in many ways it's modifying a noun, and therefore determiners is a little bit more specific and probably comes along a little bit later. And then once again, we've also added the word English, because we're not just talking about grammar, we're talking about what kind of grammar. It's English grammar, and English grammar would be considered some sort of adjective, probably a modifying noun in this case. But fine, we're dealing with a transitive verb here, and you can see the structure is set up to work very clearly. All students should study English grammar. All right, one more example, and this one is English grammar is very important. All right, now we've moved into a different category of verbs here. All right, our category of verbs here takes us in the direction of a new type of verb, because this is no longer an intransitive verb, and it's certainly not a transitive verb. This is what we call a linking verb, or if you want to use the term a copular verb. That might be more familiar to you. but we're dealing with a verb in which we're not really dealing with an action. We're more dealing with a relationship, the relationship between the subject and what comes in the predicate. There's a strong relationship there. It's either we're going to find an adjective following this copular verb. That adjective tells us something about the subject, or we're going to find here another noun, which is renaming that. Now, of course, our most common copular verb is the verb to be, and that's what we have here. So let me start with that. But well, before I talk about the copular verb to be, let me mention quickly some other copular verbs that you need to make sure that you're aware of in English. Number one, verbs like become. The verb become, even though there's an action that we can feel there, become, that it's not something and then it is something, it becomes something. It's not really a transitive verb if you think about it. So, if you say something like he became angry, or, he got sick, the verb get frequently functions in the same sense. We're not dealing with a transitive verb that has a direct object. He got what? He got sick. That's different from he got a car, where you say he got, what did he get? Well, he got a car. So the verb become or get is a classic example of a copular verb. And then the other examples that we would have take us to the verbs of sense. So verbs like look, seem, feel, even smell. All right, those verbs of senses frequently are copular verbs. Now that doesn't mean they can't be a transitive verb. So technically, you could have, he looked at the picture, and that's an intransitive verb. Technically, we would look at it as that, unless you want to look at it as a phrasal verb, and then we could argue that it's a transitive verb. But traditionally, we're going to look at this as an intransitive verb, where you're looking, you're actually doing an action of looking. But that's not the verb I'm talking about. I'm talking about the verb where you say to somebody, you don't look very happy. And obviously, we're not dealing with the way the person is actually physically looking at something. What we're doing is we're saying you are unhappy in the sense of your looks. So if that kind of made sense to you, you're understanding this copular sense where we're taking on this linking verb. Now notice here, once again, our subject is divided from the predicate in a very clear way. The line goes through that main line, the baseline. And so in this case, we have English grammar, and there's that line that dissects the baseline. Fantastic. And then we move on to is. But notice, instead of having a vertical line that divided between our verb, our full verb, and its direct object, now we have a horizontal, a slanted line. All right, I shouldn't say horizontal, I mean diagonal line. And what this is showing us, if you see that line that's slanted like this, that's sort of telling us that there's something that's actually going back and relating to the subject. So if we look at this example, the word important, the adjective important, it's telling us something about grammar. It's actually describing grammar. This is what we call in grammar the predicate position, because we have an adjective that's outside of the attributive position. The attributive position means it's within the noun phrase. It's directly related to the noun. The predicate position is related to the noun through the verb, across the predicate. So in this case, grammar is, we've got that diagonal line, and then we get important, we get our adjective here, and we have very important. Simply, very is going to give us a little bit more information about important. Once again, this kind of diagramming doesn't really deal with the exact label, but it tells us very clearly that the word very tells us something about important. All right, those are three basic sentence diagrams, and that's enough to get us started. So the next step is going to be for you to work a little bit on some different sentence diagrams. So I want you to follow this link. I've actually added this link down below in the information about this video. So go ahead and pause the video, follow the link, and work through these different sentence patterns and make sure you're understanding how the sentence patterns work. And when you're done, come back and we'll keep moving on with what we're talking about here. All right, you're back. So let's talk about the actual sentence patterns that traditional diagramming gives us. We're going to have to really start by distinguishing between types of verbs. So I've already talked about linking verbs, and I'm going to talk about non-linking verbs. The linking verbs, we'll start with those since basically we've already dealt with those. And basically the linking verbs are going to lead us in three different directions. We can either have a linking verb followed by an adjective, as in the example I gave you where I said English grammar is important or very important. We can also have a noun, so we might talk about, for example, my friend is a teacher, where once again teacher is going to rename my friend. It tells us what my friend is. And don't forget that once again we could say my friend became a teacher. We can find ourselves with different structures like that. Now don't confuse this either with a progressive form where we talk about my friend is working as a teacher. That would take us more in the direction of the intransitive verb, because that is there is simply modifying the is working. It gives us more information about the kind of aspect of the intransitive verb work in this case. Note as well that we can also have adverbial modifiers here. So we can talk about, the book is on the shelf. And on the shelf tells us information about the location of the book. So the book is where? On the shelf. And this is basically limited to the be verb. On the other side are non-linking verbs. We've already talked about the intransitive verb, and the intransitive verb, when we find them, they're extremely simple. So the first three patterns you see at the bottom of the screen there, you can already see these patterns. I mean, we've talked about examples, and I think it should be making sense to you. So our linking verb predicate adjective, English is important. Our be verb adverbial, the book is on the shelf. Our linking verb predicate noun, my friend is a teacher. And our subject intransitive verb, we'll go back to students study, our hope at least. Now let's talk about non-intransitive verbs. Basically, non-intransitive verbs, we can talk about transitive verbs or ditransitive verb. That's what I mean with that DTRV that you see there, the ditransitive verb. Actually, when I was in school, we didn't distinguish between ditransitive and transitive. The reason I'm distinguishing between them is that actually the way they taught us, it was actually kind of deceptive, because not every transitive verb can actually do what the ditransitive verb does. And so it probably makes more sense to actually create another category and talk about ditransitive verbs. And if you see what I'm doing there, you see the ditransitive verb has both an indirect object and a direct object. And so I'm assuming you're familiar enough with those terms that you know what I'm talking about. But these are verbs like give, you give someone something, explain, you explain something to someone. I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute. But that's a slightly different structure. But we get these ditransitive verbs that can have some sort of indirect object structure. Now our transitive verb on the other side. My classic transitive verb is just a direct object that follows it, although there's also a sentence pattern that is not as common in English, but it's the object complement. And notice that English is going to have a very strict syntax, and this tends to be one of the syntax problems that our students have frequently, is they want to use this object complement. They want to put it in a different position. So let me quickly talk about what we have here. Well, let me look at it with the examples that I have on the next screen. So I have these sentences here. So look at our predicate adjective, Joe is smart. Our predicate noun, Joe is a student. Our adverbial, Joe is at university. Our intransitive verb, Joe studies all the time. Notice all the time is simply an adverbial modifier. It tells us when he studies, but it doesn't really tell us what he studies, which would take us in the direction of a transitive verb with a direct object. Our direct object, Joe reads a lot of books, or lots of books. All right, now here we come down to the object complement. Joe makes his mom proud. All right, so our structure here, we get Joe makes, and if we're really thinking logically, all right, Joe makes what? He makes the completer of that makes is really his mom proud. I mean, that whole concept is there. But notice that he makes his mom, but we have to have some sort of completer, and that's where the object complement comes in. We get a noun, we get an adjective, or we get another noun, and that's going to give us more information about this direct object. All right, so his mom proud, this gives us the complete thought. It's certainly not that he made his mom, which would make it sound as if he was somehow some sort of Frankenstein creating his mother, but he makes his mom to become proud or to be proud. And in that sense, if you think about it, the object complement really takes us back to our linking verb predicate adjective or linking verb predicate noun, because that's really what's going on there. And we can feel that, his mom became proud or his mom was proud. Why? Because he did something that made her that way. So the object complement is not a very common structure in the sense that it's not like every other sentence we say is formed this way, but it's certainly a sentence that we use. And in fact, Spanish can use it as well. The example that comes to my mind is, if you talk about me hace la boca agua. There's this very clear relationship, me hace la boca, and your mouth turns into water. All right, in English we would say it makes my mouth water. Notice we just create a new verb with the noun water. We turn it into a verb, and it makes my mouth water. So that just the thought of eating that food makes my mouth water. Well, that's an example of an object complement in Spanish that might help you to remember that structure. And then finally, our indirect object, direct object structure. Joe writes his mom letters every week. All right, notice the structure here. Joe writes what? Now, if you answer that question, Joe writes his mom, that's going to be hard for us to imagine how he can get his mother to fit into that pen so he can write his mother. No, he's not writing his mother. What he's writing is a letter. Now, he writes the letter to whom? All right, there we go. He writes the letter to his mother, and this is our indirect object, direct object structure. Now, this is a very important structure in English. Very important, because notice, if you remember what we talked about with syntax, we like to move from the verb into the object. And I tried to state it that way when we talked about it, because the only thing that can come between a verb and its direct object, okay, well, we talked about the phrasal verb and its peculiarity, but the indirect object can also come in this position. In fact, this is the position it has to come in. So we say Joe writes his mom letters. Notice we can't say Joe writes letters his mom. Now you say, wait a minute, David, could we say Joe writes letters to his mom? And I say, yes, actually we can say that. We can include this indirect information, in this indirect object information, in a prepositional phrase, which then would follow our direct object. Notice what we can't do. We can't say Joe writes to his mom letters every week. That would violate the principle that we talked about when we talked about syntax, where we talked about our verb-object cohesion. We cannot do that. But we could say he writes letters to his mom. Now, interestingly enough, some verbs are basically ditransitive, but some verbs, well, most verbs should take either structure. Most verbs should either be a transitive verb, indirect object, direct object, or transitive verb, direct object, followed by a prepositional phrase. All right, to his mother, for his mother, something along those lines. But sometimes we find verbs that can't go both ways. So, for example, I mentioned before the verb explain. You can explain something to someone, but it becomes a bit awkward to say explain someone something. I can't explain you something. This is something that frequently students use when they're doing presentations. I'm going to explain you the facts of, I'm going to explain you what we've learned about this lesson. All right, that structure, it's a problem. Why? Because English, the verb explain doesn't use this structure that we're talking about here. The verb explain jumps into that direct object followed by the prepositional phrase. So I'm going to explain something to you. I'm going to explain the structure of what we've been talking about to you. Other verbs don't like to go the other direction. So I think I talked about the verb say and tell in class, and say and tell, the classic distinction between say and tell that we should always come back to, is a structural syntax issue in which you say something to someone, but you tell someone something. Tell is an indirect object, direct object structure, where say is the direct object, prepositional phrase structure. Well, let's take a look at some sentence diagramming. So, when we start with our initial elements, we start with our subject and our predicate, with our line that goes through the baseline, and then we start adding different elements. Alright, so we can start adding adjectives and adverbs. You see here, I've added the adverb straight. He went straight. It tells us how he went. He went straight to his room. Alright, I've added this prepositional phrase, this modifier, which tells us where he went. Alright, now notice this kind of diagramming really isn't telling us that straight goes before to his room. Alright, we might deduce that from this example, but it doesn't actually encode that information. That's information that native speakers would automatically pick up on, because to say he went to his room straight is going to be a bit awkward for us. Notice I'm adding the boy. I've added the determiner, the definite article the, underneath boy. Notice it's not really distinguished in any way from the adverbial element straight, not even from the preposition to. All of them are on these diagonal lines. Alright, we're also adding prepositions, but of course prepositions are interesting because prepositions, they come with this noun as well. And so a preposition is a relational word. It's always relating a noun or a pronoun or some sort of verbal noun to the rest of the sentence. So in this case you see to what? To room. And then we've got his room, because his tells us a little bit more information about room. Alright, so you've seen these kinds of diagrams now. You've worked through those other exercises. You've seen this. And now is when things start getting really complicated. Because to be honest, one of our major problems with this kind of diagramming is it works really interesting. It's really simple for these very, very simple sentence patterns. But when we actually look at how we actually speak the language, here's where we run into problems. It turns out we rarely use these sentences that are so simple and compact as the sentences that we've been diagramming. Our actual sentences start really looking complex as we start throwing in infinitives, gerunds, subordinate clauses, etc., etc. And we start actually running into things that start looking like this. Wow. It's a good thing I'm not asking you to diagram any of these sentences. Well, what I want you to work on is I want you to work on these sentences. The girls whispered. All right, we're starting off pretty simply there. Fortunately, his two brothers worked very quickly. All right, this fortunately, if you're not quite sure what to do with that, let me ask you this question. Does fortunately tell us about brothers? Does fortunately tell us anything about worked? Or is fortunately telling us something about quickly? I'm guessing that if you're thinking with me, you've answered those questions all in the negative, saying, no, it's not really about any specific word. And that's because this is what we call a sentence modifier. And really, fortunately, tells us about the entire sentence. And words that tell us about the entire sentence are normally diagrammed in a line which comes before the sentence. It comes outside, and it's designed to show us that this word modifies the entire thought without really modifying any one specific word. Surely, next Monday is a holiday. Make sure that you notice what kind of verb is here in this sentence. She put the shoes in the box in the garage, or in the garage. This sentence is interesting because actually there are two ways that we can understand this sentence. And I want to see you work on this and see what you can come up with that will give us some sort of understanding for actual, what we would call the structural ambiguity of this sentence. I'll give you a little hint. Is the box in the garage? Was that where the box was? Or are we dealing with where the box ended up? She put the shoes in the garage. So that should give you a little help there. That should help you as you diagram this sentence. The Medal of Freedom is the highest honor. And finally, number 6, we will be holding a party for the winning team next Monday. All right, so I'm expecting you to take what we've done today, the exercise that you did, and to work through these 6 sentences and prepare diagrams. All right, you'll be turning this in a project along with these same sentences diagrammed in the tree diagram system that we'll be talking about in our next session together. I hope that's been helpful to explain the topic. If you have further questions, you can write me and I will try to help you answer your questions, or you can simply Google this and you'll find a number of sites that deal with sentence diagramming, the Reed-Kellogg diagramming. In fact, you'll see videos on YouTube. And so if you have some questions about this, feel free to look it up. Feel free to take a look at some things that other people are doing and seeing if you can steer your way through any doubts that you may have. All right, my best wishes to you as you move forward and you practice working with these sentences.